Welcome to a new video lesson. In today's lesson, I will give an analysis of the plot construction and the theme of marriage in Pride and Prejudice. So, let's begin. Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice in 1797 with the title First Impressions, but it was published only in 1813. One of the Austen's most popular novel, Pride and Prejudice, like her other novels, is concerned with the theme of marriages. There are 7 marriages in Pride and Prejudice, all of them intended to reveal the requirements of a good and a bad marriage. So, in Pride and Prejudice, Pride and Prejudice is a love story of a man and a woman, and the man being held back by unconquerable pride, and the woman blinded by prejudice. Moreover, Pride and Prejudice is a satire upon life in a small village called Longbourn in southern England. So, the novel is important in more than one way. It is important both historically and critically. Historically, it introduced a new kind of fiction. 18th century was an age of picaresque romances with splendid places, high towers, underground passages. It was an age of the stories of terror, horror, and mystery, as opposed to such romances. Sentimental novels full of tears and sorrow were written. Her, that is Austen's, most modest theme is connected with the upheavals and complications brought about in the lives of two people by a couple of comparatively common flaws in human life. It is the pride of a young gentleman that creates a strong prejudice in the mind of a young lady. The prejudice grows deeper due to situations that follow, until a series of events bring about a reconciliation between them. And all's well because it ends well. The main plot in the story of misunderstanding, is estrangement, and finally union in the lives of two persons, that is of Elizabeth and Darcy. Okay, so the main plot is a story about misunderstanding, estrangement, and union between these in the lives of these two people. There are the subplots like the Jane Bingley relationship, the Lydia Wickham episode, and Collins Charlotte episode. All these things or all these threads are most harmoniously woven into an artistically convincing design. The novel begins with the flutter and eager expectation in the Bennet family, that is Elizabeth's family, at the arrival of the young single man of a large fortune, Mr. Charles Bingley. For some time, the Jane Bingley subplot attracts greater interest. They meet at a ball, are attracted towards each other, and their intimacy grows over through dinner parties, balls, etc. All this while, however, the events of the main plot are also gathering interest. Darcy and Elizabeth are present at the same ball. Even though Darcy is looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, he is soon discovered to be proud, and when Bingley persuades him to dance with Elizabeth, he says that she is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt him. Elizabeth developed not very cordial feelings towards him. This prejudice, formed in the very first meeting, is intensified by various other factors, and no event helps to remove it. Miss Caroline Bingley's designs on Darcy and her efforts to reprobate Elizabeth during her stay at Netherfield are so persistent that in spite of his being attracted to Elizabeth's pair of fine eyes, he realizes that it is dangerous to pay too much attention to Elizabeth and observes studied reticence. Mrs. Bennet's silly remarks, Mary's all too quick consent to sing at a party, Mr. Collins' sycophany, Mr. Bennet's want of propriety, and Lydia's shallowness. In fact, everything that the Bennet family did is enough to alienate anybody, and Darcy's poor opinion of the whole set urges him to avoid closer connection with Elizabeth. When Elizabeth meets Wickham, his winning manners grow on her goodwill, and the altogether false reports of his so-called victimization by Darcy intensifies her prejudice far too much against Darcy. Later, when she naturally suspects that Darcy plays a prominent role in ruining the prospects of her sister's marriage with Bingley, that is Jane's marriage with Bingley, she feels an almost irrevocably strong prejudice against him, which is quite natural. From chapter 3 to chapter 33, the prejudice grows in better strength. And so when Darcy proposes to her in so extraordinary manner, she flatly and bluntly rejects him. In reply to his inquiry about why she refused, she lays the charges at his in front of him without any apology. The first stage in the history of their relationship is convincingly developed. Chapter 35 and 36 mark the climax in this development. Darcy's letter to Elizabeth marks the beginning of the second stage. Every event occurring subsequent to this helps to reverse Elizabeth's conceptions of him, undo all knots of prejudice, and reveal the sterling qualities that he possesses. Even at the end of the first stage, his repulsive pride completely dominates all his thought and action. But the citadel staggers at the first rude shock Elizabeth gives him. She showed him how insufficient were all his pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased. And even though he was angry at first, he soon realized that the lesson she taught was hard intended at first, but most advantageous. When they met most unexpectedly at Pemberley during her visit, he showed her by every civility in his power that he hoped to obtain her forgiveness and lessen her prejudice or ill opinion. Darcy's excessive pride is decreased, and Elizabeth becomes proportionately less prejudiced. Many events in the second stage quicken the cleansing process. Even in the offending remarks about her family, there is an admission that Elizabeth could inspire in Darcy a strong feeling of love capable of overcoming his strong scruple of family pride, and her vanity is touched. Darcy's narration in the letter makes it clear to her that if he found Jane's behavior without any symptom of peculiar regard for Bingley, it was pardonable, even justifiable, as error of judgment, and the motives were certainly unchallengeable. The baselessness of her violent charge of ruining Wickham's career becomes all clear to her with Colonel Fitzwilliam's report. Colonel Fitzwilliam's report about Darcy is also creditable. All these events make her conscious that she had acted despicably, and that her certainty about her discernment was most unjustifiable. Her visit to Pemberley brings another surprise. His housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, is genuinely proud of Darcy, who is, and I quote, the best landlord and the best master, unquote. Affable to the poor, which is also in quotes, an entirely good brother, and she is sure to know better. Darcy's unexpected meeting at Pemberley is still more effective. He impresses her aunt, that is Elizabeth's aunt, and uncle by his excellent manners, and Elizabeth has to admit that her prejudice was ill-founded. Finally, Darcy's most invaluable help in the episode of Lydia's elopement with Wickham sweeps off all her objections. And so, when Darcy's second and most polite proposal is made, her attitude has changed as much as his. The first major episode in the Jane Bingley relationship, it can be treated as an independent event. But Jane Austen has woven it well in the main theme, that Jane and Elizabeth are sisters who share each other's secrets, hopes and fears in the simplest connection. But on the strength of Darcy's regard, Bingley had the firmest reliance, and of his judgment the highest opinion. And so when Darcy suspected that Jane did not love Bingley as fervently as Bingley loved her, and found that her family had all vulgar manners and shallow tastes, he readily engaged in the office of pointing out to him the certain evils of such a choice. This was one of the very important reasons of Elizabeth's strong prejudice, and thus it is connected with the main theme. The Wickham Lydia episode and the Collins Charlotte relationship is equally well connected with it. While Elizabeth has developed a prejudice against Darcy, she is very much attracted towards Wickham, and it is very long before she knows what his real character is. One of the two strong charges she levels against Darcy is the ruining of Wickham's prospects. The truth is revealed to her by Darcy, but because of her silence on this point, she cannot stop her sister's elopement and the slander on her family. It is this catastrophe, however, that brings Darcy closest to her, because it is because of this love for her that he finds out the fugitives and makes successful effort to bring about a marriage between Lydia and Wickham, neglecting the thought of the loss to him. Mr. Collins proposes to her and later marries her best friend, Charlotte. All the threads are thus connected. The structure is therefore most cleverly unifying. So, it can be said that the novel traces the relationship between Elizabeth and Darcy, marred by pride of Darcy and prejudice of Elizabeth. But unlike Sense and Sensibility, which is a study of opposites with the character traits between two sisters, Pride and Prejudice is more complex, with the character traits divided between a man and a woman, initially hostile to each other and eventually attracted to each other. It is also to be noted that pride leads to prejudice and prejudice invites pride. It is Darcy who first exhibits pride in refusing to dance with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is thus prejudiced against him, but her prejudice itself stems from her wounded pride. Darcy's first proposal, in fact, is a climax of pride on his part and prejudice on hers. The real turning point is a letter Elizabeth receives from Darcy, which makes her reevaluate Wickham's story as well as Darcy's part in keeping Bingley away from Jane. In writing the letter, Darcy has humbled himself, and Elizabeth begins to recognize Darcy's good qualities. But it is not until after all the external action of the visit to Pemberley, Lydia's elopement, and Darcy's rescuing of Lydia, and Lady Catherine's interference, that Darcy and Elizabeth are finally united in marriage. It is a marriage built on love and calm judgment, and therefore good, and thus it claims that they have won over their own prejudice and pride. Okay. Marriage and courtship are the central theme to this novel. Besides satirizing the society, it is stated in the very first chapter that Mrs. Bennet is an eager mother who is out to find good matches for her 5 daughters. In the course of the story, this theme is developed through the plot, and the 5 marriages in the novel show varying degrees of good or bad or successful or unsuccessful marriages. But involved in this larger theme of marriage is the theme of pride and prejudice, the feelings which come in the way of marriage, which is most deeply incorporated in the relationship between Elizabeth and Darcy. So we will look into each relationship, each marriage here. in the context of the novel and try to analyze each of them. Okay, so the relationship between Miss Bennet, that is Jane Bennet, and Mr. Bingley. It is parallel plot. It is a subplot of Jane's romance goes on without disturbing the main course of the novel. At first glance, it may seem that Jane is as important as Elizabeth. But Elizabeth is definitely the heroine, for she dominates the action and represents the prejudice in the title of the novel. Jane is too perfect, too good, too simple a character to be a heroine. She is a flat character. We will discuss flat character and round character in some other lesson. Also, we will deal about whether this novel is an epistolary, whether any traits of epistolary novels are found in this poem will be discussed in another lesson. So it is Elizabeth who is an intricate character with a mix of the good and the bad, and hence more interesting. Jane Bennet and Bingley are not sufficiently profound, and their romance is on subsidiary level in the novel, and their affair depends ultimately upon the change of heart in the Elizabeth Darcy affair. The Jane Bingley marriage is another good marriage in the novel. If we look into the marriage of Charlotte Lucas and Mr. Collins, it can be called a marriage of convenience. So Charlotte Lucas marries Mr. Collins only because of a need for economic security. She opts for it because there were hardly any means of earning an independent livelihood for the daughters of gentlemen in those times. The marriage dramatizes the economic inequality of women and is an example of a bad marriage. If we consider the marriage or the elopement and then the marriage of Lydia and Wickham, it can be considered as a marriage of passion. The runaway marriage of Lydia and Wickham is an example of this, based as it is on superficial qualities. As good looks, it is bound to end at best in mutual toleration. Wickham often leaves Lydia alone while he cavorts in London. This again is a bad marriage, as passion is sure to disappear after a while. Now let's consider Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Their marriage has also been disastrous, with Mrs. Bennet being foolish and vulgar, and Mr. Bennet increasingly isolating himself from his family as he is unable to respect his partner in life. All that they have in marriage is mutual forbearance. The plot has a symmetry in the way in which the events are balanced. The novel opens with the most famous line. The opening sentence of this novel is probably one of the most famous first sentences found in fiction. It sets the tone for the entire novel, in that the whole work is a masterpiece of irony, both structurally and verbally. The sentence begins as though the novel were to be a great philosophical discourse, but it shows the real picture of the society, and it presents ironically the picture of the society, picture of the 18th century society. The first line is, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." Very simple line, right? So it says that it is an universal truth which is quite acknowledged over the universe that a single man who has a good fortune must be in want of a wife, right? But the fact is, this simple construction is not important, is not the real truth. The real truth lies otherwhere. It shows that, but it tries to show ironically that a woman, a single woman who does not have fortune in 18th century society must be in want of a husband who has lot of good fortune. Okay, so it is ironically represented the conditions of the society, the conditions of women in the society. Okay, so this shows how a person is in a position, how a man is in a position to get a wife of his own choice, right? But a woman who cannot be independent, cannot be self-dependent in 18th century society. She has to look for a prospective partner who will give her economic security besides the social security. Okay, so what we see here is that the conditions of the society is ironically presented. So irony is a main part of this novel. We will deal with it in another lesson. We will deal with the irony and humor that is presented in Pride and Prejudice in another novel, another class. So the novel opens with parties and balls and ends with marriage, that is with social affairs. Bingley and Darcy make two arrivals, an optimistic one in the beginning and a gloomy one towards the end. There are two surprise meetings. Charlotte's near the beginning, and there are two surprise marriages, not meetings. There are two surprise marriages. Charlotte's near the beginning and Lydia's near the end. Structurally, the opening chapters are short, thus making for speedy movement of the plot. The viewpoint is that of comedy, and hence the humor comes into place. Irony is being said before. Now it is the humor, and hence customary elopement and other dangers and difficulties are overcome with the minimum of sorrow to end in marriage. At the end, we have Jane Austen's oft used technique of profusion of letters which report and explain events. Thus, the plot of Pride and Prejudice has precision, simplicity and symmetry. There are no obtrusive characters, no digressive episodes, and each event, each slight incident, each conversation, each speech is indispensable to the plot. The interdependence of the main plot and the subplots is complete, and the interplay between the characters and the events is held in perfect organic unity. Lawrence J. Clipper compares the various movements of the novel to, and I quote, the movement of dancer in a minute, which takes part of its beauty from the overall organization of many dancers. Jane Austen's incidents are natural. Her characters have an independent reality, and yet they all fall into a neat logical scheme, a well knit, integrated, coherent plot where no incident or character is out of place. In spite of such a calculated composition, the characters of Pride and Prejudice, and indeed of her other novels, gives us a sense of spontaneous life we get from a play of Chekhov. The precision, simplicity, and symmetry of Pride and Prejudice evoke instinctive appreciation. So well it is constructed that the plot has a symmetry and structure of a drama, the action proceeding logically from exposition, complication, and climax to the denouement and finally the resolution. Jane Austen uses the dramatic narrative mode and irony so effectively to build her plot that it would not be amiss to say that she is the most perfect dramatist who never wrote a play. The story revolves around stock romantic situation of girls being wedded to eligible bachelors is of course interesting, but even more interesting is the way the subject is treated. There is a depth and profundity in the way the various characters and their motives for marrying are analyzed, and finally the propriety of Elizabeth Darcy marriage based on mutual love, understanding, and trust is upheld. The ironic exposition of the themes of appearance and reality, intricacy and simplicity. On the other side, the skill in plot construction, in characterization, and the mastery in dialogue all make Pride and Prejudice, all makes the plot of Pride and Prejudice gives the plot of Pride and Prejudice a unified whole, which makes the novel a classic. Okay, thank you.